Okay, so why don't we resume with our titles? I just wanted to give you a few examples of poor titles, and you can tell me what you think in the comments. So, how about and these are ones I've seen, and or are based on ones I've seen. So let's see. One, how about Sestina, which is actually the title of a poem by Elizabeth Bishop. Um, a rather good sestina, to be honest, but I don't think the title is all that great. It just tells you what kind of poem it is. Um, Going home, sorrow, imagine, a song of love. So you can see those are all pretty generic. They don't really give you a sense of the flavor of that particular poem, essay, story, whatever it is. It doesn't really give you the flavor of it. Um, let's see. And then as far as critical essays, some titles, Colonialism in North Africa, which is it does give you a sense of what the subject matter is, um, but it doesn't tell you specifically what the argument of that essay is. Or how about Social Media? Another pretty poor title. So that should give you a little bit of a sense of what doesn't work. I think it obviously helps to start by rereading whatever your piece is, whether it be an essay or a short story or a poem, with fresh eyes. So if you wrote it a week, 2 weeks, hopefully even longer ago, and you come back to it to do editing, approach it as if you were reading something for the first time, as if you were reading something new, and it will feel new. If enough time has gone by, it does start to feel as if it were written by somebody else, and then you can really kind of look at it with fresh eyes. As far there's different strategies that you can use depending on what kind of writing it is. So I think for a poem, for example, it can be really pretty. Um, let's say let's put an easy strategy to pick verses or phrases from your poem that stand out. Because what a lot of people do is they'll go to their poem and then they'll give it some sort of lackluster, abstract type of title like Homecoming. And unfortunately, this could be anybody's homecoming and what it exactly it is about, or summer travel. And it could be an amazing poem, and it just has this trite, mundane title. So go to it. And one of the best things I find, and kind of an easy thing to do, is take 4 or 5 lines, entire verses or phrases in there of your original verse, something that's particularly well articulated, pull it out and see if you can, if that particular verse really epitomizes your poem. And by epitomize, I mean, does it give a sense of what the overall subject is? Does it give a sense of um, some of the main themes of your poem? Or maybe it might even highlight something that might not just be apparent to the reader on an initial reading. So, for example, let's see, I'm just going to look at some of the poem titles that I have picked out, and I actually found some pretty good ones just off the top of my head. One of them is by a poet named Wallace Stevens, and it's a rather long poem called An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. And it's a rather long, contemplative, and philosophical poem. But even if you haven't read the poem, and I assume that many people will not have read a number of the things that I reference in our short session together, um, you can get a sense of really the flavor. I mean, An Ordinary Evening in New Haven. It just gives a sense of the flavor of the poem, the subject matter. It doesn't give a sense of how philosophical it's going to get, but it's almost suggestive in how mundane it is. Um, and then there's William Butler Yeats's The Second Coming. So for those who have some biblical background, the second coming certainly is not the most original concept. It's a big part of Christian theology, but the second coming, and when you see it in the context of this incredibly symbolic and seemingly mythological and historical poem, the second coming elevates it and also gives another dimension to what William Butler Yeats might mean, because um, the idea of this kind of apocalyptic end really is only just suggested. So the second coming highlights and emphasizes something that's there that might not be so apparent. Then you've got like the name titles, titles that are names, that just the name itself is not something totally ordinary like Elizabeth, but that the name is pretty lush in its own right. So you've got things like I've chosen two from Sylvia Plath, from her poems, poems that really captured me as a teenager. One is called Ariel, mythological, and Lady Lazarus. So both of those are mythological references, and might not be all that apparent to everybody, but even if you don't, they are suggestive of the type of thing that you want to look up, and they're lush in the sort of resonance that they have. So those are some good examples of what you of poetry, poem titles. Um, some other ones here then, for other genres. We've got um, for fiction. If anybody's heard of Charles Dickens's Bleak House, and Bleak House is actually um, the name of a house in the book, a rather long, one of Dickensian really long novels. And Bleak House, so it's the name of the house, but it really also suggests so much about the novel. It's all about this long um, civil case of inheritance that goes over generations and causes lots of people to commit suicide or go crazy because they're waiting for this inheritance that never comes. There is this bleak, depressing substrata people in the characters in the novel, and also those who um, are able to overcome that, or are that represent a more optimistic side of humanity. And then the house itself is this sort of charming Victorian house that used to be bleak, and that becomes, through the owner, John Jarndyce, it becomes this really pretty lovely home. So the house itself, I think, is suggestive of the kind of resurrection, of the kinds of um, ability of people to transform themselves. So I think it's a great title, both for the house and also for the novel. And so you can pull something right out of, and best to pull something right out of the piece. So that is the name of the house. It's pulled out of the novel, and it emblematizes, it epitomizes so much. So that's the kind of thing that you'd want to go for. There is, let's see, short stories here. I chose two from Flannery O'Connor because she's just so good with titles. One is Everything That Rises Must Converge. And I actually don't believe that line appears in the story itself. But it is a really good line. Everything that rises must converge, because it is a story about a young man and his mother, and basically a bus ride to her reducing class. Somewhere I really should be going. I should go to a reducing class to get rid of those pandemic pounds. But she's a sort of lovely lady with a lot of the foibles of a person of her age and demographic in um, Jim Crow era Atlanta, and she is sort of her son can really doesn't get her. He's come back from university, and he finds her racist and horrible and small minded. So all of these social forces, all of the sort of psychic forces between the mother and the son start really converging on this bus. So it is such a what's so wonderful about that title it has a sense of this tremendous philosophical metaphysical importance around something that is so mundane. So there's a real contrast between that sort of philosophical title and this really mundane story about uh, mother and son on a bus ride. So that's why that title I think works really well. Is just kind of a balance that's kind of yin and yang between the high-minded philosophical title and the more everyday normal type of story that's told, although with incredible consequences at the end of the story when the mother has a stroke and the son realizes that he's going to have to deal with the guilt for the rest of his life. Um, in terms of critical essays, so I have a critical essay, one titled by Harold Bloom. It's a literary journey type of book that it goes through all these different writers through time and traces. It has a thesis that every generation of writers is reacting to the previous one. It's directly reacting to what happened right before, and so you can really trace um, changes in the history of literature through what he calls the anxiety of influence. That is, that writers have a sense of anxiety of being really carbon copies or just being overly influenced by their mentors, by the writers that were influential in the generation previous to them. So the anxiety of influence is a really fantastic title as well, and it has a subtitle after that that gives a more specific description. But the anxiety of influence captures the heart of his thesis, um, and oftentimes when you have a kind of a more mm, theoretical title like that, it will be followed by a subtitle that gives the rest of the more detailed explanation of the um, book. So, but for your purposes, for these kinds of critical essays, um, the anxiety of influence is a great one. And he continues after that a theory of poetry. So that's that. And let's see, and we will have let's just do one more possible title here. Um, yeah. Well, we I had assigned last term for a lot of people to read a personal essay that made a big impact on me when I was young, um, by a writer called Alice Walker, and it's entitled "Beauty: colon when the other dancer is the self." And I think a lot of my students are shall we say, tempted to give or to write give the reader a title that is totally abstract, like beauty. Yes, that is something that is touched upon in this essay. I mean, touched upon is the subject of it. She comes to it over and over and over. But it's so vague, isn't it? And that's the whole thing about it. She talks about this really general abstract idea in a very precise way. By precise, I mean she takes what would be what is beauty? This kind of philosophical question, aesthetics, philosophy of aesthetics, um, and tries to approach it from her own life, and namely, the she had an accident when she was young with her brothers had a BB gun, shot her in the eye, and she had this ugly scar, which she was very self conscious of, which drew a lot of kind of unwanted negative attention toward her, but it also affected her eyesight. And so the whole thing is sort of meanders through these very uh, heart-rending, very specific moments in her life that capture her struggle both with being able to see, to perceive beauty, and trying to conquer her feelings about how she thought people perceived her in light of this physical defect. But there's this one moment where she that involves her seeing herself as as a dancer, dancing with herself. So she takes this look at, yes, the abstract idea of beauty, but then captures this very particular moment in her life when the other dancer is the self. But also that you could think about it in a more philosophical way. What does that mean to dance with the self? And how does that capture some notion of beauty? So it ends up being like starting with this really trite idea of what is beauty and bringing it to a very specific moment in her life and also a much more philosophical, theoretical question. So what we begin to see is that these titles, whether it be poetry, critical essay, personal essay, or a short story, they begin with things that come right out of the literary pieces themselves. They could be a symbolic thing like that home in Bleak House. Um, they could be something related to a character. It could be related to a phrase or the subject of the poem, etc., like an ordinary evening in New Haven. Or they could heighten an idea that is only alluded to, like the second coming. Um, and in critical essays, you really want to capture the thesis, like Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence. So that gives you a little bit of a nutshell of all the things that should go into you coming up with a title.